Welcome back, Honors. All right, welcome back to it. Happy Easter break. All right, so I don't know about y'all, but it has been something else being able to actually sleep in and let my body wake myself up, except for this little muscreant little puppy over here who just will not let me sleep sometimes. He's like, I gotta go outside. Come here, pee-pee. Come here, buddy. All right, so now look. So the big thing about it, though, is as Pierre is here to help to actually introduce this new unit, we're now starting off on Unit 10, right? Unit 10. You're taking your 10th test. You only got 2 more left, and then the class is over, right? Yes, high five. All right, so now, the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is that this is going to be Unit 10, and it's going to be Imperialism and World War I, all right? So this is the unit where we're going to be reading our book, All Quiet on the Western Front. We're going to be doing that in 2 weeks, right? So be ready to read and digest and actually enjoy this book and this text and things like that, and then we'll worry about our postings and things like that later on in the next unit as well. But we got a month of school left, and we got to read a book, but we're going to do it, we're going to enjoy it, and it's really not that long of a book, so you'll be okay. Now, the big thing about it, though, is I do highly suggest is that you actually consider maybe doing the audio book as well, so you can have a pace that you can set, and then also just understanding that we are still going to have flips while we're doing this stuff, but remember, it's block schedule. You got 2 days to do those assignments, so you're going to be just fine, isn't it right, puppy? Now, the big thing about it, though, let's go ahead and start off this unit with our first concept. We're introducing imperialism, right? Now, imperialism is probably one of the most screwed up things that has ever happened in history, right? It's going to go down during the late 1800s, and it's going to dramatically change the tone of which Europe is going to be influencing the rest of the world. Basically, what's going to happen is imperialism is going to be the construct where Europeans are going to use superior technology and military force to go take over and steal resources from other places that are not Europe, that basically are inhabited by they're inhabited by people who are not European, who are not of their descent, and they're going to take over places like Southeast Asia, Africa, parts of South America, and things like that, and they're going to force their will upon them, right? So let's go ahead and talk about building overseas empires and what that looks like, what imperialism is, and this fancy new Prezi that I actually have mad Mr. Mathern vibes going with this. Now, the big thing about it, though, is imperialism is the concept or the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or a nation over foreign countries, right? So the idea, in a sense, with imperialism is the concept where we're actually using a military force to extend our empire over a different area and especially over foreign countries, right? So now the thing about it, though, is you can see imperialism in these 2 political cartoons that I have over here right on the actual sides, right? So, for example, this is imperialism. So I don't know if y'all know this or not, but everybody in America knows who Uncle Sam is, right? Uncle Sam is the personification of the United States. He's the guy with the white hair and the little goatee mustache and the red, white, and blue hat, and he says, I want you to join the military, right? That's Uncle Sam. So England has a similar person like that. They don't call him Uncle Sam, though. They call him John Bull, right? And John Bull wears a black top hat. He's got little puffs or tufts of brownish, reddish hair that come out the sides. Boogie down. They come out the sides of his hat. And the big thing about it is he is the personification of England, right? He is the personification of England and their empire and things like that. He wears suspenders. He's kind of round, right? Looks kind of fancy. But this right here is John Bull, except instead of in this one having suspenders and being round and things like that, he has all of these arms and these hands and these octopus-like features, and he's extending his influence and taking over other places that do not belong to him, right? For example, you've got Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Jamaica, Canada, India, Egypt, Malta, Cyprus, the Cape Colony, Gibraltar. All these places, by the end of the late 1800s, England is going to basically own, right? That's imperialism, okay? Imperialism is the concept of extending your empire through basically force and using those areas to actually try and believe to grow your economics, even though ironically enough, it's going to cost you a lot more than anything else. Same kind of thing too. This is imperialism after World War II. That right there is supposed to be Soviet or communist imperialism that was growing following World War II, as you can see with Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, China, things like that. So this is in and of itself, in essence, the idea of European powers pushing themselves out there and growing their influence. And I have a very famous quote that you need to write down for this. This is a quote on the level of all roads lead to... Hey, that's not the quote. Hey, get out of there. Get out of the bathroom trash. Now, anyway, so this quote is on the level of all roads lead to Rome. It's that big of a deal. It is that important. And the quote goes like this. Go ahead and write it down underneath the imperialism definition. It is, the sun never sets on the British Empire, okay? So British Empire map, let's go ahead and look at that real fast. So what does this quote exactly mean, right? What does this actually mean? What do we think that the concept of the sun never sets on the British Empire and how it exemplifies imperialism really truly is getting at, right? I'm going to give you a second to think about it. I hear a lot of y'all shouting out right now. I hear Gianna shouting out something about like not being stopped, and I hear Damare shouting out some other stuff, and I'm also getting a phone call as well from my cousin really quick. Give me 1 second. Hey. Okay, so I just took that phone call. Sorry about that. But I did hear while I was on the phone, I heard like Cobb screaming from the background, and I also heard Giselle Perez back there screaming in the background. What it's trying to get at with this sun never sets on the British Empire thing is basically the fact that, as you can see here in red, is stuff that is stuff that the English owned, that the British actually took control of. That is imperialism, right? They took over Australia, India, certain sections of Africa, areas in South America, Canada, and that since their empire was so large, the sun was constantly shining on it at any given moment in time, right? Kind of like the concept of like when people say it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Yeah, so similar idea that the sun is literally constantly shining on something that the British Empire owned or controlled, right? Which is absolutely ridiculous when you think about the grand scheme of things and actually the growth of this empire. But that is imperialism in a nutshell, right? But some of y'all are probably asking yourself a little bit too. You're like, wait a minute, haven't we been talking about imperialism like this whole time then? Like if this is just about like people extending their empires and stuff, then weren't they doing that ever since like Columbus? Like is that considered imperialism? Well, that's considered a type of imperialism. You could refer to that as old imperialism, right? So the big thing about it though is we do have two different types of imperialism. So the big thing about it though is we got old imperialism, we have new imperialism, right? So old imperialism is the concept of like colonialism. That's when it's going to be going down from like the 16th to the 17th centuries, those couple of hundred years following like Columbus. It's the idea of setting up colonies, right? Colonialism is like Jamestown, Roanoke, the colony of New Orleans, right? Setting up these different areas where people are going to be sent, their population is going to multiply, and they're going to actually create land and colonies and then send raw materials back to their like mother country, quote unquote, for it to be processed and then sent back to them, right? That's more of a colonial empire and things like that. And as you can see, because in these colonial maps, these are occupied by Europeans directly, right? And these Europeans are living in these places. For example, this is the colonial plan for New Orleans, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that's colonialism. New imperialism is military takeovers of foreign lands. That's going to be happening in the 18th and 19th centuries, and big places that are going to be taking over are like India, China, and Africa, which we're going to be talking about it when we talk about new imperialism, right? And so as you can see right here in this photograph, we have military officers who are white and English taking over this African country right here, and as you can see, it's just two of them in this crowd of native people, right? So that's that military takeover aspect, the idea of using only a couple of hundred people to take over an entire foreign land and then take and steal their raw materials, right? So the big thing about it, though, in the long run is, as we continue to grow, what are the real motivations behind this? So, like, everybody knows that with old imperialism, with colonialism, your motivation was to grow your power, grow your area, take raw materials, and make more money. Well, similar kind of motivations are going to be going down with new imperialism. Most of it is economical, because by the late 1800s, Europeans are taking over most of the known world. So, like, you're talking about the entire continent of Africa, with the exception of 2 countries, is going to be taken over by European powers. You've got different areas in Southeast Asia being taken over by European powers. You have all these different places being taken over by European powers, mostly in the pursuit of money, right? Like, so mostly in the pursuit of the idea of getting raw materials that do not grow or like actually have like a plentiful amount of them in Europe, shipping them back to Europe, having them made into things or using them in factories and actually growing or creating more money with those items, right? So items like these things that they were trying to get after, Europeans wanted things like palm oil, petroleum, rubber, cotton, iron, copper, gold, diamonds, things like that, right? Now, there's pretty much everybody on this entire, like, watching this flip right now knows what several of these things are, right? You know what cotton is, you know what iron is, you know what copper is, you know what gold is, you know what diamonds are, right? A couple that you might not actually know, right? Palm oil, petroleum, and rubber are 3 things you might not necessarily know. And some of you are like, I know what rubber is. Like, shut up, I'm not there yet. All right, so now look. So palm oil is this substance right here that Europeans really, really wanted because they would actually like drain or press these like little palm orbs right here in the seed pods, and this oil would actually come out of it, right? So the big thing about palm oil is what it was used for. It was used because it has a very high smoke point, right? So it has a very, very high point of temperature resistance before before it begins to burn off. What can you use that for? Lubricating factory machines, right? Keeping them actually running and keeping them from seizing up or actually like basically melting their parts together. So you got that is one really big element as well. Then you've got some other stuff. Petroleum, right? Petroleum is going to be a big thing that's going to be very important, especially going into the 19th or late 19th century, early 20th century. Petroleum is crude oil, right? Crude oil is the stuff that you actually see when you look at those like big oil derricks. So like offshore oil rig, Gulf of Mexico. So like if this is an offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see right here, that is an oil derrick. You've seen a bunch of those. You know that Louisiana is heavily involved in using these things. Well, those are used to mine petroleum, and petroleum is literally made out of old dead organic matter. It's fossil fuels, right? So it's actually made out of like old dead dinosaurs, right? So the thing about it though is that petroleum would later be used and distilled and made into gasoline and made into like now in the modern era jet fuel and asphalt and stuff like that, right? So petroleum is a high resource that even in the modern era, people desperately want. Now the last one is rubber. Now, the reason why I bring up rubber very importantly is because around the turn of the century, going from the 1800s into the 1900s, the invention of the automobile and several other things had come up, increasing the demand for rubber, right? Rubber comes from trees, okay? So, like, you probably didn't know that, but yes, rubber comes from trees. It's a white, sappy substance that actually comes and filters itself off of trees. You then, like, span it out. You then dry it out, and what is left behind, that dried substance, the stretchy stuff, is rubber. And the reason why it's like white here and not white when it's on your tires is due to the fact that they add dyes and things like that and mix some petroleum products in it to make it a little bit more heat resistant, right? So rubber was a big thing that grew a lot in Southeast Asia, okay? So like these Europeans are going to want to take over these Southeast Asian countries in the pursuit of those goods. So that's one big reason, right? And also some of y'all are probably like, why did you put the word ironic right there? Well, ironic because actually, ironically, they didn't make as much money as they spent on imperialism, right? The imperial colonies cost tons of money, and it costs a lot of money for mining resources and actually keeping control of these areas. So ironically enough, they lost money. They didn't actually make any money. But one big thing that was still a very heavy motivator for them was nationalism, right? So that's a huge motivator going forward. So the big thing about that nationalism aspect is the fact that nationalism is when Europe is also taking over these countries with imperial gains as a form of nationalism, as that pride perspective, right? And we looked at, or we're going to look at in class with this ABCs for Baby Patriots, right? So this was a children's book that exemplifies that idea that Europeans wanted to take over other lands so they could grow their national influence and be able to basically say, hey, look, France, we have more stuff than you do, right? So like in this idea of growing your power and influence in your military respects. So this book right here is a good... Oh, good Lord, that's gross. All right, so an ABCs for Baby Patriots, right? 1899 is when it was issued by Mrs. Ernest Ames. And as we can see, instead of having like A is for apple and B is for banana, it has stuff like B is for battles and C stands for colonies. Rightly we boast that of all great nations, Great Britain has the most, right? Which ties back in to the sun never sets on the British Empire concept, right? This is a very important motivator, and it's the main motivator behind imperialism in the late 1800s is the idea of nationalism, right? Relating back to that military dominance and military takeover and the growth of these different empires. So that going forward, though, as well, there are going to be other smaller motivations like religion, military outposts, foreign markets, things like that, right? The other smaller motivators are basically like, oh, we're trying to spread Christianity. Other ones being like, oh, we want a military fort so we can keep an eye on other countries. Or the idea that we want to sell different goods to these people that we're taking over, right? So that's other smaller motivations. But the biggest example of other big things about when it comes to imperialism is like, why now? Like, why now? Why is imperialism all of a sudden changing face in the late 1800s? Why in the late 1800s is all of a sudden imperialism going from colonies to being military takeovers? Well, a lot of it has to do with post-industrial technology, right? After the Industrial Revolution, technology is going to take a gigantic leap forward. And this new technology is going to help Europeans spread their influence further and further like they never have and never had the ability to previously, right? For example, this is a big thing. The Maxim gun, right? The Maxim gun, which was invented in 1885, is the very first fully automatic machine gun, right? As in fully automatic, you hold down the trigger and the bullets keep coming out. The Maxim machine gun could fire about 200 rounds per minute without, well, it jammed pretty often, but it still could fire about 200 rounds per minute, only taking one person to operate it, right? Remember, this is in stark contrast to like the muskets that Europeans have been fighting with for about like 2 centuries before that, where you could only fire 2 shots per minute. This fires 200 shots per minute. Now, no matter what group of people, what local indigenous group of people goes up against that weapon, they simply have no chance to be able to stop it, right? But the Maxim gun is going to be invented in 1885, along with several other rifles, including breech-loading rifles and semi-automatic rifles, that are going to just give the militaries of these countries the ability to spread their influence so far. Then you've also got steam-powered vessels, right? Steam-powered transportation is going to be a massive thing that lurches this imperialism forward, because the steamboats and factories and machines are going to make it so they can now travel further without stopping, and then also bring goods back without stopping, right? So steam power is going to be much more efficient than wind power, and these steam-powered vessels can now traverse rivers. They have low berths, so they can actually go through shallow waters, and then they can also travel from places like England all the way to the different coasts of Africa and all the way through the Mediterranean. So that is a huge thing. But then there's another really big one that's super important that you need to highlight, circle, underline, make it look like it's exploding. We're talking about this stuff right here, quinine medicine, right? So quinine is from a plant in South America, and this is what the plant itself actually looks like. But the thing about it is, quinine had been discovered and been being used by the Incan empires for hundreds and hundreds of years. They just made an effort to never tell Europeans about this specific medicine, right? Well, this medicine that grows in the rainforests of South America will get a bark on the outside of it. If you strip that bark and boil it down, you can make quinine medicine, which basically eliminates the symptoms of malaria. Now, malaria and that disease, malaria, was a big thing that prevented Europeans from being able to push further into places like India, from pushing further into places like Africa. So this quinine medicine will make it so Europeans can now be immune to the disease that was preventing them from going further than they actually had before 1850, right? Now, for example, quinine is a liquid substance. Usually British soldiers would actually drink it in their daily gin and tonics, right? So quinine medicine is going to be a very important thing, which is going to basically shift the tides and is going to give the ability of these Europeans to go in and basically ransack, kill, murder, steal, and take things from people that have no business even interacting with, in continents like Africa and Southeast Asia, where they should have just stayed out of. So speaking of continents like Africa and Southeast Asia, we are now going to move on to some specific examples of imperialism, and the first one we're going to talk about is right here, the imperialization of China by the British, right? So the British in China is going to be a very important example of imperialism. We're going to have 3 specific examples of imperialism by the time that this unit or this section of the unit is done. We will talk about the British in China, we will talk about the British in India, and then we will talk about all of Europe basically carving up and stealing Africa from African people, right? So the British in China is a very key place to start, though, because you have to basically ask yourself, why are we going? So the thing about the British in China is that you have to be able to do that thing that y'all all hate doing, which is, of course, rewinding all the way back to the 1790s. Now, so if we're going to understand the imperialism of China, we have to be able to jump all the way back to basically what's going on in Britain during their Industrial Revolution and jump all the way backwards to the 1790s, right? So in the 1790s, you need to understand that Britain is broke, right? So Britain, in Great Britain, is broke as a joke when it comes to their government and their former wartime economics, right? They're very, very poor because, on a government perspective, because these wars in the American Revolution have been leaving them with absolutely no money, right? Wars like the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and their ability to be able to actually wage war and win war has been severely affected. And so the big thing about it is they're running out of money. Now, it's not going to be that way forever. The Industrial Revolution is going to make them a ton of money, but it's only in its infancy at this point, because at the 1790s, James Watt's steam engine is only about 20 years old, and it hasn't even really been applied full scale yet, right? So the thing about it is Britain does not have a lot of money. Thing about it is, though, China is not broke, right? China is very, very wealthy. China is also very wealthy mainly due to this concept known as economic isolationism, right? Economic isolationism in the sense that China has goods and products that the rest of the world wants, and they have economically isolated themselves away to the point where they're look, y'all have this, y'all want what we have. We're not going to you to bring it to you. If you want it, come get it from us. And by the way, if you want to come get all the stuff that we have, like porcelain, tea, silk, like other different items like that are actually like printed fabrics and all these things that are super, super like expensive, especially the porcelain. Europeans have tried for hundreds of years to make porcelain on the level of Chinese porcelain, and they could never do it, and even when they tried to make their own, it was still garbage, right? Like, so everybody wants these Chinese goods, and the Chinese government says, since you want them so bad, you'll understand that there is only one city that you can go to trade with us, and it's called Canton, right? Canton is one city on the port side of China in southeast China, whereas the only city that Europeans are allowed to go to pick up goods and bring them back. It is a very ingenious system. It keeps China very, very safe. It keeps them economically isolated, and it has been a system that has kept them very wealthy and very prosperous for several hundred years. Well, the British are a little upset as well because they are addicted to a product that China has. They are losing money not only on wars, but their households are also losing money on their tea addiction, right? You have to understand the big thing that's going to end up happening in the late 1790s is that British people are going to become addicted to caffeine, and they're going to become addicted to caffeine in the form of tea. Some British households are spending as much as 10% of their yearly income on tea coming from China because it's something that they ingrained into their culture, and they had a time for it, and that's what they always drank. While the rest of the continent's drinking coffee, the British are drinking tea, right? It's just like when we saw with the Boston Tea Party. Tea is an important resource for the British, and they're losing a lot of money on it because China is so economically isolated, and Chinese tea is very expensive, right? So the British come up with a thing. They're like, what's a good that the Chinese people might want that we could trade them for tea? Oh, I have an idea. How about drugs? Like, so the thing about it is they decide with one of the most disgusting, screwed up events in all of history that they're going to trade Chinese traders opium for tea, right? So not really a fair trade in this sense, but you have to understand that opium is going to be grown in India. This, by the way, is opium. Opium is a flower, okay? It comes from a poppy plant. Some of y'all may have interacted with this stuff in this scene from a very famous movie.
Now, my beauty, something with poison in it, I think. With poison in it, but attractive to the eye and soothing to the smell. Poppies. Poppies will put them to sleep. Sleep.
What's happening? What is it? I can't run anymore. I'm so sleepy.
Here, give us your hands and we'll pull you along.
Oh, no, please. I have to rest for just a minute. Toto. Where's Toto?
Oh, you can't rest now. We're nearly there.
Exactly, right? That is the scene from Wizard of Oz where, like, they run into the poppy fields and they all fall asleep because opium is a depressant, right? Opium is also going to be used to make modern-day things like heroin, methadone, and opium-based painkillers, right? So it's a massive depressant. That's why Dorothy and the guys fall asleep, right? So the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is looking at this opium drug and stuff like that, it's crazy illegal in China, right? The British plan to grow opium poppies in India and then trade it to the Chinese for tea and sell it for a profit in England. So the idea would be that they would grow opium for next to nothing in India and then meet Chinese traders in the water and then exchange chests of opium for chests of tea, and the Chinese traders would then illegally smuggle it back into China and sell it to people because of how illegal it is. Opium is not something that the Chinese government wants in their society. It's stupid illegal for a reason, because people can't live lives and work on opium. Opium sends you into a deep slumber state where it basically knocks you out, makes you catatonic, and then also it's highly addictive, and people die from it overdosing regularly when they use it illegally and they smoke it illicitly, right? So the thing about it is the Chinese are trying to figure out, whoa, where is all this opium all of a sudden showing up? The British did this anyway. They did it anyway, knowing it was illegal, knowing it was the wrong thing to do, all because they wanted to open a closed China. So you have to understand that's a big word that's going to get thrown around here right now. China was closed to the rest of the world, right? And you said they said that you could only trade with them in one city. Well, the Brits are going to change that when they start opening China, quote unquote, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is this is going to lead to a series of wars known as the Opium Wars, very aptly named. The Chinese are going to try to stop the sale of opium by dumping it and seizing it at ports, right? There was this one very famous event, actually, where a Chinese ambassador sent by the Dowager Emperor, because it was the Qing dynasty that was actually ruling over China at the time, who had brought them into 200 years of glorious celestial kingdomness. The thing about it is the Qing dynasty hires a man by the name of Lin Jisoo. And Lin Jisoo is right here, who is a Chinese diplomat who decides to create a massive campaign of seizing these chests of opium from Chinese smugglers at these different ports and dumping it into the water and destroying it, right? And he actually seized at one point 21,000 chests of the stuff from a British vessel and destroyed it. And then guess what also, by the way, Lin Jisoo even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria trying to be like, hey, can you please tell your East India Company to stop selling illegal drugs to my people? I'm asking you very nicely. And then apparently Queen Victoria never saw the letter. Yeah, okay. So now, the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is he destroys these 21,000 chests of opium, and then the Brits had the audacity to demand money for the destroyed product, and he was like, no, we're not going to give you money for the illegal drug that you're trying to trade for tea. So the Brits demanded compensation for their drugs, and the Opium Wars broke out when the Chinese refused to compensate them, right? The first one is going to rage from 1839 to 1842, and the second one's going to rage later on from 1853 to 1860. That was a lot of this this arsenic bread and this bakery and all this other stuff. But the thing about it is that the Chinese are going to lose these wars because they were technologically behind the British, right? In the first Opium War, they lose in a dramatic fashion due to the fact that most Chinese, if they have guns, are using muskets. And if they don't have guns, they're using swords and bows and arrows. Because of the fact that they were economically isolated and so prosperous using what they were doing, they never had a need to actually advance new military weaponry and things like that. Most of the Chinese vessels, as you can see, are still wind-powered. And they're being attacked by steam-powered vessels, as you can see right over here in the actual background of this. That is actually going to be a steam-powered boat that was able to destroy Chinese boats and naval fleets very, very easily. Oh, by the way, the Americans, the French, and the Russians also helped out the British in the actual Opium Wars and helped destroy Chinese militaries, and they're going to forcefully open China, quote unquote. And what's going to happen is they're going to establish these things known as the Century of Humiliation and Spheres of Influence, right? China would be opened and the spheres of influence would be established. What a sphere of influence is basically these colored areas on the map. So right here, this is the area that Russia wanted to trade in. Right here is the area for the French. Yeah, that's the area for the Germans, actually. This green area is the area for the Brits. This is the area that Japan ends up taking over, and the French end up taking over French Indochina. Spheres of influence basically saying that the French will trade here and take all these goods from China. The British will be here, and they basically take over land that they had no business taking over. China was open. The spheres of influence will be established. All the Chinese ports were open to international trade. Britain is going to own Hong Kong literally up until the 1990s. Merchants also would not be subject to Chinese laws, but only to the ones of their own country, and the Chinese had to pay them for the Opium Wars. This starts what's known as the Century of Humiliation, or about 100 years of time where China was humiliated by the Europeans because of their desire to open them up and actually take their goods from them. Rebellions will rise up against this, like the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion that we'll talk about in class, and these uprisings would be crushed by coalition armies of French, Russian, American, English armies, and millions of Chinese lives would be lost. Over 20 million died in the Taiping Rebellion alone. But that right there is going to be where we're going to hold off on this, and we're going to talk more about imperialism when I see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.